we go. So, hello everyone. My name is Carlo, CEO and co-founder of London-based startup FlexSea. So, as we all know at this point, we all have a huge plastic problem. Around 1.2 billion barrels of crude oil used every year just to produce plastic. And because how it's mismanaged at the end of life, a lot of it actually ends up in nature. In the ocean alone, about 12 million tons per year, which is equivalent to one whole garbage truck per minute. These over time degrade into micro and nanoplastics that make their way all the way up to us through the food chain through a process called bioaccumulation. And with plastic waste predicted to double to 760 million tons by 2034, we need to do better, especially because existing solutions such as recycling are not viable. Just under 10% of plastic globally is recycled, and existing bioplastics on the market are all derived from scarce resources and food crops, which require arable land and fresh water to grow, as well as pesticides and fertilizer assistance throughout the growth cycle. And at the end of the day, they're not truly degradable. They will only degrade in industrial composting facilities for the most part. Which is why at FlexSea, we are leveraging naturally occurring red seaweed biopolymers to replace those materials. We're developing materials that are truly home compostable, but they will degrade in nature within 8 to 12 weeks post-disposal while being shelf stable. In fact, our materials are so natural you can even eat them. And because of how we are not classified as plastic on the legal side of things, we actually help companies avoid all EPR laws, plastic bans, and plastic taxes. What we have developed so far are thin films to replace single-use flexible plastic packaging, and that's what really started the project. And over the past few months, we also have developed a whole new second vertical, which is extrudable pellets, which are compatible with existing injection molding machinery to replace rigid and semi-rigid plastic packaging. And in the future, we also want to go into coating and adhesives very soon. Why use red seaweed, you may ask? Well, red seaweed grows faster than any crop. Whilst sugarcane and beetroot might take anywhere between 6 months and 18 months to grow before you harvest it, red seaweed grows in just 45 days. It's grown sustainably at a very large scale, a scale enough for us to produce 3 million tons of our materials literally tomorrow morning. And it sequesters a whole lot of CO2, much more than any other land crop, as much as 2,000 tons per square kilometer of ocean surface area that is cultivated. The market for plastic packaging, as you might expect, and you probably know, is huge. This is a snapshot of what it will look like for the films and the flexible plastic packaging alone. $100 billion every year are used in single-use flexible plastic packaging, and there's roughly a 70 to 30% split between food and non-food applications. In the UK, this represents for us a £5 billion opportunity. And what's really interesting is a 17% compound annual growth rate for compostables across all industries. Where we want to position ourselves is use our patented formulations, for which we already have one patent on the films, one more coming up in the next few months for the patent for the extrudables, and another one in our pipeline for a biotechnological application as well, and lease those IP formulations to existing plastic manufacturers who can use it to integrate our own materials into their portfolio of offerings. This allows us to keep our capex as low as possible, leverage their production capacity, their own portfolio of clients, as well as it allows us to scale very rapidly. We find several of these players in different geographic locations. Where we want to work and invest in is upstream, looking into biorefinery and the actual processing of the seaweed and improving the yields of those extraction processes, which in turn will help us to make our materials even more sustainable and cost-effective downstream in the long term. We have gathered a lot of traction from the market with letters of intent and people willing to use our materials as soon as it hits the markets, all the way from small startups like us and slightly bigger SMEs to larger players and the multinational corporations such as DS Smith and P&G, with which we have planned pilots by the end of next year. We also have secured seaweed supply from 2 main suppliers, one based in Indonesia and one based in Madagascar, in order to have raw material to work with and to secure different geographic locations to kind of de-risk our sourcing. The core team is made of myself and Thibaut, my co-founder, as main founders. So myself having a background in business management and entrepreneurship, and Thibaut being a material science and engineer. Mattia, our very first hire, is a PhD in bioprocess engineering and biotechnology with core expertise in extrusion and bioprocess fermentation. And there's also Andy, which is not in the pitch because he's a very recent hire, who in fact is a PhD in formulation chemistry, which has worked in the Nestle confectionery industry in the past. We're followed by a tight group of advisors, both on the business side and on the academic and research side, to kind of guideline our R&D and where we want to go with our journey. And we have raised a pre-seed round early this year, with which we expanded the team. So it was only us co-founders. Now there's 4 people working full-time and a bunch of interns rotating. We expanded to better lab facilities and did a whole lot of industrial trials to de-risk the whole process and make sure that our current materials are both
time is up. Sorry, I forgot to give you the 1 minute warning. I try to keep the phone open, but it then turns off the screen itself. Let me, how much are you guys raising while I pull in the other investors? Want to share a little bit more?
We're currently raising £2 million to go to market and bridge the end of R&D, planning to go to market by around end of Q2, beginning of Q3 next year.
Very cool, very cool. Well, thanks for presenting. Thanks for sharing. It's definitely a fascinating market. The question is how it turns out and how low you can get the prices. While I bring in the other investors, can you talk a little bit more about your plans to reduce costs and to have a kind of cost competitive bioplastic?
Of course. So I think I'll start by giving an overview of what the plastic costing looks like today. So I have petroleum plastic, which goes between $2.5 and $4.5 per kilogram. Then you have PLA, which is the most abundant bioplastic on the market today, which goes anywhere between $5 and $10 per kilogram, based on where it's made and the kind of grade you're working with. Then you have PHAs and PHBs, which are home compostable. Technology has been known for the past 40 years. However, it's failed to scale because of how complicated it is to make them. And they go between $10 and $15 per kilogram. Right now, at our price point, we are between $10 and $12 per kilogram. So we already are competitive with the higher end bioplastics on the market today. And we have concrete plans to reduce our cost to the $5 to $7 per kilogram, mainly by working on the waste which is created during the seaweed extraction and integrating that waste as much as possible, either by generating valuable components which we can use to increase the properties of our material, or just integrate the waste in a raw form into what we do, essentially with the aim of increasing the output ratio between raw biomass of the seaweed and our output material. If we can produce more with the same standing biomass at the same cost, because the waste is essentially given to us for free, we can just slash the cost because we're producing more at the same price point. So that, in a nutshell, is how we plan to do it.
Understood. Matt, do you want to kick things off? Questions from the Vector side?
Yeah, so, it's actually like a personal hot topic of mine, using seaweed for plastics. So I guess first and foremost is you're using red seaweed. That has been a hot demand item over the last 2 years for not just for the bioplastic industry, but for a whole suite of, macroalgae to, X product value. How are you securing your supply chain, whether through some long-term supply contracts with people in East Asia or South America, or, do you have any other methods of making sure that supply chain is there, and especially for the species of red algae that you need?
Yes. So as I said earlier in the pitch, we have secured supply from 2 different suppliers, one of which, Variocean, is actually a company which is working on the traceability of the whole supply chain itself. So you'll find that the red seaweed supply chain right now has been kind of spread and it's not really easy to follow because of so many players in it and so many hands which the seaweed exchanges before it actually reaches the end buyers. What these companies are doing is they're tracing the seaweed they're selling all the way back to the farmer in Indonesia, Philippines, or wherever it is that they're making it. And that is one way to secure, in fact, the sustainability of the seaweed. We have a material which has the potential to be carbon negative. There's no point of us using a seaweed raw material which, yes, it absorbs CO2, but before it reaches us, it's gone three times around the world. That's not what we want to do. Talking about just securing the seaweed itself, yes, we're going out to seaweed manufacturers. We also visited seaweed manufacturer and extraction sites, different ones, in fact, to understand exactly how it's made, where it's coming from. And so we have direct relationship with those companies. We're not buying retail, we're going all the way up to the manufacturers. And seaweed supply, yes, it has increased a lot in demand in the past few years, but you'll find that the supply itself has also increased a lot. Since, I think, 2011 was the first projection that was made. They did 10-year projections on how much red seaweed would be produced. And in fact, they had to review these projections every 4 years because by then, that 10-year projection number had already been exceeded. And in fact, the only curve in production, the only kind of dip, has been seen during the COVID lockdown period. And the reason was because of a lack of demand, not a lack of supply. We've talked with suppliers and farmers in South America, for instance, which is not a big hub, but has a huge potential to become a big production hub for the red seaweed. And they told us that the reason they're not producing more is because no one is buying their seaweed. So there really isn't a problem with the sourcing itself, and we're tapping into a very well-structured and very mature raw material pool already. And that's why we're using red seaweed rather than brown seaweed, because it's more cultivated, and also the polymers that you can find in them are different. So it allows us to have better properties in our material.
Mm-hmm. And then following up on that, actually now on the downstream processing of this. So how, like, given that you had validation testing, how does this hold up under, using contract manufacturers for production? How does it hold up in existing injection molding machinery? And also, too, how does that relate to either producing rolls or pellets for these materials, whether or not before or after end sheets?
Of course. So the films and the pellets that you can injection mold with, we produce in two different ways, but both with existing machinery. So the films are producing through a die casting technique, and the pellets are just compounded on twin screw extruders. So both of them are existing industry machinery. And once you create the rolls with die casters, you just have rolls of material which you can load onto flow pack machines and such. And essentially the material is transparent, can be printed on it, can be colored, and can be heat sealed. So it just behaves like plastic, just a matter of setting the correct speed on the machine. Because modern machines are essentially large computers with robots attached to it, you just have to plug in the parameters that you want it to work at, and it will do so. With the pellets, so once we get the pellets through the filament chopping out, essentially from the extruder, you can just load them up on existing injection molding machinery, and you have successfully injection molded different items such as just plates and dog bones for material testing and property testing of the plastic. So both have held up pretty decently. Just a matter of setting up the parameters, really. We don't melt at the same temperature as plastic, so you won't use the injection molding machine at the same temperature as plastic, for example, but just a matter of putting the number in.
Sounds good. And then do I have time for one more question?
Yeah, go for it.
All right. The last one is, given that you're going after the LDPEs and polypropylenes of the market, these are commodity plastics at $5 to $7 a kilogram, at scale. How do you justify the slight green premium, and how do you actually get the cost parity from there?
So we recognize that cost is a main driver in demand for packaging from the producer side. You can be the most sustainable company out there if your material is 10 times more expensive. Unless they're held at gunpoint, the buyers won't buy it. That's why we have those plans to decrease the cost to become as competitive as possible with petroleum plastic. Petroleum plastic, which we believe will increase in price in the future through plastic bans, plastic taxes, and just rising oil prices in general. So even though we will probably never become as cheap as they are today, because they will increase over time and will decrease over time, the delta will definitely become much smaller. And what we can sell as a storyline is we are the only material which is truly home compostable and potentially competitive on an economic point of view. So if you take PHAs and PHBs, they're probably the best material out there today because they're not derived from petroleum and they do degrade in nature. In fact, PHAs and PHBs are a natural part of the marine carbon cycle, but they're just incredibly expensive to produce and they're very limited in quantity as well. We already are kind of on the cheaper end of the PHAs and very soon cheaper than PHAs and PHBs. So those are the ones which we really see we're competing against. And because we do degrade in nature in natural conditions, unlike PLA, which is the cheapest and most abundant bioplastic out there, we believe we can be a very compelling packaging alternative for companies initially higher end who are looking to have a more sustainable approach to their things, to their operations and how their consumers demand. But at the same time, down the road, also for major players. And that is shown by the companies for which we had demand for. I mean, P&G definitely looks at sustainability, but they look at cost because of the margins they are, and yet they are interested in our material at our current price point.
How much are they interested in, though?
So I can't say too much because it's kind of confidential, but essentially we're planning to do a pretty large scale pilot starting the end of the year for their cosmetics range. So we integrate our material in their existing products, essentially.
To replace all of their existing, or so they can have a PR push?
For film.
Okay, I want to kick things over to Taj now. Taj, do you want to? Taj is here with Include Ventures. You want to share briefly just what you guys do at Include Ventures, Taj? His video's got to be off. Long story, but Taj is a great investor, and I'm sure he's got some good points there.
It's actually a short story, and I'll share it now. But it's also about why we need to do what we're doing. So I'm currently in treatment for dialysis. I go Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays at 4 a.m. to 9 a.m. The reason for that is because there were environmental factors of where I grew up in Dallas, Texas, that impacted me and many other people. So I say this, and I'm very clear about it, very public about it, because I want us to know as investors and as founders, the products that we're making is not just about the earth going for 2 degrees Celsius. It's really about now, and about people who may not look like anybody else on this call, who are coming from communities of color, poor communities, not just in the US, but in Europe, Africa, and beyond. So I'm Dr. Eldridge. I'm a co-founder and GP with Clue Venture Partners. We are a US-based fund that focuses on 2 things. We invest in other venture funds that are focused on climate and other factors, as well as co-invest alongside of them in the areas of Series A and Series B. Some of the areas that we're really interested in on the climate space include food innovation, transportation, energy distribution, circular economy, and waste reduction. So looking forward to hearing some of your pitches and everything else. I'm going to go off camera because you can imagine it's probably better to see this square than to see all this medical stuff behind me. So thank you, Matt, and thank you, everyone.
Oh, I'd forgotten to put the spotlight on you. I didn't know you wanted the camera on. Sorry, but I think either way, that's something important for us to remember is this isn't all just theory. There are real lives at stake, and I mean single-use plastics are one of the big ones. One of the biggest questions I have is you're growing this right now, or suppliers are growing this in our oceans. What's the effect of increased salinity on seaweed growth in the future as humanity tries its darndest to ruin our oceans? Can seaweed help? Is this something where you have more problems as the situation destabilizes? What does that look like?
So seaweed growth and seaweed cultivation is, I don't want to say a cure-all, but it's almost too good to be true. So you'll find that where there are seaweed cultivations, there is increased biodiversity because seaweed creates a kind of a barrier. It slows down incoming waves, protects coast from erosion. It supports livelihood of about 500,000 families of seaweed farmers in Indonesia alone. And just underwater, the carbon that seaweed takes in is through the form of carboxylic acid. That's what carbon is when it is dissolved in water. So because it's an acid, in fact, the CO2 absorption of seaweed is directly contributing to deacidifying the oceans, which is a big issue right now. Salinity-wise, it has not been an issue for the seaweed cultivation itself. Of course, there will be limits. You cannot grow the seaweed in the Dead Sea, but by the time the ocean becomes a Dead Sea, we'll all be dead anyways. So I think there's going to be bigger problems than not growing seaweed at that salinity point. When it comes to general seaweed cultivation, there really is no harm. Absolutely. The red seaweed, the way it's grown, it's essentially tie it at regular intervals on a line or a rope, set from the coast to a couple 100 meters off the coast. And the little seedlings, technically they're called propagules, that's what the name of the baby seaweed is, grows in 45 days, harvest them, and as long as you leave a tiny bit on the rope, through vegetative propagation, it will actually grow back into a new bush that you can harvest again. And because those species do not anchor themselves to rocks, there is no issue that if a piece breaks off, it will grow into the local ecosystem and become invasive. That does not happen with red seaweed.
And we've seen a lot of attempts with seaweed, with algae, etc., to create sustainable climate solutions, both for carbon capture, for alternative proteins, for alternative plastics. And there hasn't been a lot of success. Why do you think that is, and why will you be different?
So when it comes to protein, for example, I wouldn't say it hasn't been a success. I think it's just been a case of mislabeling. Seaweed protein content isn't very high. Of course, you can derive seaweed protein from the raw seaweed biomass, but selling it as just purely seaweed is wrong. And there are many companies that that are using seaweed as part of their own alternative protein content, whether it's for making fish alternatives. I think companies like Betta Fish, for example, and that kind of alt protein sphere, all the way to even meat and bacon. And that's one side. When it comes to biofuel, there's been a wrong approach to how much oil you could actually extract specifically from microalgae. And microalgae is pretty unsustainable to produce as well. It requires a lot of energy, it needs to be centrifuged, and a lot of space for very little yield in the end. And that's what kind of burst the bubble, especially in Silicon Valley and towards the first 2010s. With biomaterials, really, I'll say that there hasn't been a specific failure yet. There's several companies in the sphere. We're all running up towards the same goal. Big market, not going to be one single winner, especially because all the materials are slightly different. Just like today, you have several different kinds of plastics. There's not one size fits all for plastic applications. There won't be one size fits all for seaweed bioplastic applications. So it's a matter of finding your niche and where your material performs best and try and go for it. There's no truly seaweed-based biomaterial on the market today. We plan to be among the first ones of them.
Very cool, very cool. Then to keep things moving, I would kick over to Jason. Do you have any questions for the team and FlexSea?
Yeah, sure. And great presentation. A lot of my questions answered already. But just in terms of like competitors, not necessarily other bioplastics, but if you're looking at companies even switching from traditional plastics to your products you're creating, like who would the main competitors, or what would be a comparable company that you want to be seen replacing from your end customers?
Well, in fact, I'd say that those companies that you call our competitors, I call them our opportunity. We don't want to replace the Barrys or the Amcors or the Mitsuis, the biggest plastic producers and distributors out there. We've actually talked to them, and they are aware that they're selling what essentially is a dying product, and their own customers are demanding a more sustainable solution. So when it comes to existing petroleum plastic producers trying to switch, we want to be the ones that allow them to be the switch, be the cheap source of R&D for them, license our technology to them, and leverage what they're already doing. They're a huge company. If we can use them to sell what we're doing, it's a bingo on the way I see it. If you look at other bioplastic companies, bioplastic from seaweed, what really makes us different is the seaweed we use. Majority of them use brown seaweed, smaller share of the market, non-cultivated, grows in different areas. So you have limited production because they live in colder, they grow in colder water areas. And the biopolymers you use are different. So it means we actually have different properties of the material. With red seaweed, you can have transparency, you can have heat sealability and better gas properties. With brown, you have at best a translucent material, which is not heat sealable and has worse gas exchange properties. Just to cite one, we had to run tests on the oxygen barrier machine 3 times because the machine was broken, but in fact, nothing was going through. We have better barriers to gas than existing LDPE plastic. And that's thanks to the polymers we use that are only found in red seaweed.
Great. And is there any like residual smell from the seaweed that's used in production?
No, not at all. There's a very neutral smell. There's nothing of it, and even I mentioned earlier, you can eat the material. It's tasteless.
Okay, and how much, or is this a vertical, or how much of a factor is kind of the movement towards either commercial 3D printing or printing at home and the use of biomaterial plastics in that space?
Yeah, funny you mentioned this because we actually have one grant here in the UK to actually 3D print cases with the base of the NHS to essentially replace inhalers for the inhaler casings for asthma inhalers, which can be 3D printed, and that's one of the things we're working on. So 3D printing goes kind of hand in hand with injection molding, as many things are 3D printed before being injection molded. It's just cheaper and faster, and our filaments are compatible with that.
Perfect. Yeah, appreciate the responses. Great presentation, and yeah, great questions all around.
Thank you so much, everyone.